This video is entitled Do-It-Yourself Exploitation, a tutorial of sorts for capitalists, wannabe capitalists, and anyone else on YouTube who wants to know how best to exploit a workforce. Of course, most of you on YouTube are probably not capitalists, so you're going to have to put on your imagination caps here and pretend you're a capitalist in order to get the most out of this video. First, to review, why is it important to exploit workers? To really get the best answer to that, you should really see my video, Where Does Profit Come From? Parts 1 and 2. But I'll review a little bit here. You, the capitalist, you wake up in the morning with money. You spend your money on labor and capital. Soon you have commodities to sell. At the end of the day, after you've sold those commodities, you have more money than you started with. You've made a profit. Now, you're not the only capitalist in the world. There are lots of them, and they're all competing with you. If they can make more profit than you, they can afford to sell their commodities for slightly less than you. That would put you out of business. You need to take your profit and reinvest it back into production in ways that will increase your returns on investment. And all the capitalists you are competing with are constantly trying to do the same thing. There's an imperative need to constantly improve production to make it more profitable. That is what I'm here to help you with. If you're going to end up, at the end of the day, with more money than you started with, you are going to have to create more value than you pay for in the production process. Now, I know you're thinking, couldn't I just charge more for my products than it costs me to make them? Well, not really. See, you're competing in the marketplace with other capitalists, all of which are trying to lower their prices to outsell each other. You can't just raise prices arbitrarily to create a profit. Now, I know you're thinking, it almost sounds like a paradox that you lower prices to increase profits, but that's what capitalists do. Instead of worrying about prices in the marketplace, you need to figure out a way to create more value in the production process than you pay for in the production process. You have two different types of input, constant capital and variable capital. Constant capital inputs are incapable of creating more value. That's why we call them constant. Machines, raw materials, factories. As they are used up, these inputs pass on their value to the commodities you produce, but there's no way to make them create more value than they are initially worth. For instance, a microchip is a microchip. It can't turn itself into two microchips. A machine only works at a given speed for a limited lifetime. You can't whip it to make it work harder or longer. Variable capital can create more value than you pay for it. That's because variable capital is human labor. When you pay a worker to work for an hour, you have no idea how much value they are going to produce. They could work hard, or they could take it easy. They could be unproductive or productive. They can be cheap or expensive to hire. Everything is variable. It will be a constant struggle to figure out the best way to get the most value out of them at the least cost. Sometimes they'll even resist. They're a huge pain in the ass, basically, but you're going to have to get used to them, because this unique variability is what allows you to make a profit at all. So you ask, how exactly do I go about exploiting these workers? Well, that's what this video, Do-It-Yourself Exploitation, is all about. First, let's start with an equation. Now, if you're afraid of math, don't worry, this equation has no numbers, but I think it'll be extremely helpful for demonstrating the concepts I'm going to talk about here. The equation says E equals S over V. E is the rate of exploitation, and the denominator is V, which stands for variable capital. That's the money you've laid out for wages. And the denominator is S, the surplus that your workers produce for you. Workers will produce enough value to cover the cost of the wages you pay them. The rest of the work they do is your surplus value. That's profit. Constant capital, or C, is missing from the equation, although constant capital will reoccur in some future equations, in some different videos. Constant capital does impart its value or cost onto the commodities as well, but it cannot produce extra surplus. That's why it's not in the equation. Your goal as a capitalist is to increase E, the rate of exploitation, by adjusting the ratio of surplus to variable capital in your production process. Let's look at some different strategies for doing that and figure out what some of the best strategies are. First of all, what happens if you increase both surplus value and variable capital without changing the ratio. You could do this by hiring more workers or making the same amount of workers work longer hours. This would increase the total amount of surplus extracted, but it wouldn't increase the rate at which the surplus was extracted. Still, it would be more profit. Let's look at the hiring more workers strategy first. If all capitalists pursued this strategy, pretty soon there would be full employment. And you know what that means? Higher wages, because the demand for labor is rising. Higher wages mean an increase in your denominator, that is, the amount of wages you pay, which eventually would mean a falling rate of exploitation and less profit. The other strategy, having workers work longer, capitalists are always trying to get workers to work longer. And if it wasn't for the 40-hour work week, we might still have 60, 70, 120-hour work weeks, like a lot of industries used to have in this country, and a lot of other countries still do. But even with the 40-hour work week, there are plenty of ways you can get workers to work longer. Limit their vacation and sick time, make them work longer anyway, and threaten to fire them if they complain. That one really works. Or you could even hire other workers to work a night shift. I mean, you've got to realize that while your workers are at home sleeping and eating, which are pretty useless to you, while they're home sleeping and eating, all of your constant capital is just sitting in an empty workplace being totally useless. At the same moment, other capitalists out there in the world are pumping out commodities. You can't let them be more efficient and productive than you. Both of these approaches, hiring more workers or making them work longer hours, are effective in increasing the total amount of surplus value extracted from workers. In times of expansion, it often makes sense to increase outlays on variable capital. But this strategy is much more powerful when combined with a tactic that changes the ratio of surplus value to variable capital, so that workers are producing more surplus value per worker. There are many ways to do that. Let's look at some. First of all, you could just pay workers less, but make them do the same amount of work. This would lower V, your outlay on variable capital wages, while keeping S the same, thus raising the rate of exploitation. Capitalists are always trying to find ways to cut wages. You can not raise wages at pace with inflation. You can cut pensions, benefits, or you can just cut actual wages. You can limit or eliminate paid sick days. Is there any limit to how low you can set wages? Well, keep this in mind. Workers will use their wages to buy food, clothing, housing, entertainment, etc. These things are all necessary in order to keep them alive and healthy enough to come to work each day and create a surplus for you. We call this reproducing the worker. If you didn't pay them enough to reproduce themselves, keep themselves alive that is, they wouldn't come work for you. Of course, the standard of living changes from country to country, so you can always move production to a country where it's cheaper to reproduce the worker. The state is quite helpful to you in reproducing the worker. In many countries, the state and private charities usually provide a modicum of education and social services so that the poorest of the poor don't starve to death. Food stamps, housing projects, homeless shelters. These things all make it cheaper for you to hire low-wage workers because you don't have to pay the full cost of reproducing the worker. The credit system provides a similar function in reproducing the worker. You don't have to pay the full cost of reproducing the worker because workers can just borrow money from banks, take out mortgages, buy things on credit, etc., and go into debt. Once in debt, they will be even more tightly chained to the institution of wage labor, even more desperate to take any job, work extra jobs, or work long hours in order to pay off their debts.